If stories about justice, quiet strength, and second chances mean something to you, take a second. Tap that like. Hit subscribe to Shades of Injustice. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We remember the people the world tried to forget. There's a kind of silence you find on old streets. Not because no one's there, but because too many have been pushed out quietly. In the forgotten corner of West Grove, an old librarian, long retired, long underestimated, found herself holding not just the deed to a house, but the final page of a story someone thought would never be read again. They thought she wouldn't fight. They thought she wouldn't matter. They were wrong. This is the story of Celeste Brooks, the woman who turned a rusted key into a revolution. Welcome to The Librarian and the Locksmith. Only here on Shades of Injustice. The wind in West Grove whispered like it remembered things no one else did. Celeste Brooks, age 62, stood in the middle of her creaking porch, wearing a blue cardigan too warm for spring. In her left hand, a letter. In her right, the last mug of coffee she would allow herself today. She didn't drink it, just held it like people do with memories too bitter to swallow. The letter was from a law firm she had never heard of. It said her house was being foreclosed due to missed mortgage payments. Missed payments. But Harold had paid everything. Every damn thing before he left this world, with lungs full of silence and hands that had once planted a cherry tree in their backyard. Celeste folded the letter slow and neat, then went inside. Later that week it happened. She returned from the corner store with a bag of tea oatmeal and canned peaches. But when she turned the key in her front door, it didn't fit. Not jammed. Changed. She stood still, groceries digging into her elbow. The lock she and Harold had installed 29 years ago, the one he oiled every Easter, was gone. Replaced by a newer, colder metal flush with the frame like it had always been there. But she knew better. A lock never lies to the one who closes the door each night. Celeste set the bag down, then called a locksmith. 20 minutes later, a rusted pickup pulled into the gravel driveway. A man stepped out, wearing a gray hoodie with the sleeves pushed up. Muscular, black, tattoos faded under sunburned skin. He moved like someone who knew how to be quiet without being invisible. "Ma'am," he said, walking up the steps. "I got a call about a changed lock." Celeste looked at him. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then, Tyrone Ellis. He froze, blinked. "Yes, ma'am. I taught you. 7th grade. You used to draw race cars on the back of your spelling tests." He laughed, surprised. "That was a long time ago." "Doesn't mean I forgot." Tyrone scratched the back of his head. "You're Miss Brooks." She nodded. He stood straighter. Like an old instinct kicked in. You remembered me?" "You're not the kind of child people forget," she said. "You made noise, but you had kind eyes." A beat passed. The sun was beginning to fall behind the roof line. Tyrone looked at the door. "So, you said the lock was changed without notice?" "Yes." "No bank visit, no sheriff, no papers on the door. Just this," she said, handing him the letter. He skimmed it. His brow darkened. "This ain't standard foreclosure process." "I know." "Did Mr. Brooks?" "He passed 2 years ago. Lung disease. I'm sorry." Celeste looked out toward the street. "I didn't call to talk about my grief, Tyrone. I called because someone is trying to erase me." He nodded once, then knelt to the lock. She watched as he worked, steady, careful, quiet. She remembered the boy who never sat still, who always looked out the window like the world had something better for him if he could just escape the classroom. Now he was a man. And he had come back through the same front gate he used to throw rocks through. "Done," he said after a few minutes. "I reset it to your old key pattern. But this hardware, it wasn't cheap. Someone wanted in and wanted you out." She took the key. It fit again. Before he turned to leave, she asked, "Do you ever miss being bad at everything?" He grinned. Every day. She smiled. First time in a while. I made peach tea, she said. Too sweet. Want some? He hesitated, then nodded. And for the first time in months, someone stepped into Celeste Brooks' house without trying to take anything away. The lock clicked behind them like a period at the end of a sentence. Inside the house exhaled a silence that had been holding its breath for too long. Tyrone placed his toolkit by the door, careful not to scuff the wooden floor. Celeste moved with quiet precision, as though her body still followed rhythms from a time when every movement was deliberate, every choice intentional. You want to sit? She asked. I'm okay, he said, eyes glancing across the room. Books, they were everywhere, stacked in neat towers along the wall. Shelved 3 rows deep, some cracked at the spine, some with yellowed pages like dried leaves. It smelled like oak lemon oil and memory. This place hasn't changed much, Tyrone murmured. I didn't have a reason to change it, she replied. He followed her into the living room, where a low lamp hummed over a half-finished puzzle and an untouched cup of tea. Then he noticed the envelope on the floor just under the bookshelf. He bent down, picked it up. Miss Brooks? She turned. This was behind the shelf. She took the envelope, studied the front. It was addressed to Harold. No return address. The seal broken, but still tucked inside was a thick letter. Heavier than usual. Legal paper. Celeste opened it, read the header. Carrick and Nolan, LLP, she whispered. Never heard of them. Law firm, Tyrone asked. Yes. Looks like mortgage revisions. Something about refinancing the house. He looked up. Harold already paid it off, right? Every last penny. Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. Tyrone walked around the back of the bookshelf, looked behind the other shelves. More envelopes? 5, no 6, all from the same firm. All addressed to Harold, dated within the year before he died. Celeste sat down at the puzzle table, carefully lined them up. Her eyes scanned each line like she was proofing an obituary for truth. I don't remember any of this, she said. He never mentioned a new agreement. And Harold wasn't the kind to hide things. Not from me, unless someone asked him to. Tyrone leaned on the armrest. He didn't have dementia or anything, right? No, she said, shaking her head. Sharp until the last week. He gestured to the letters. These look official, stamped. But who are they? She stared at the signature line. No personal name. Just for and on behalf of Marion Heights Property Trust. A trust, Tyrone asked. Celeste opened the drawer of the puzzle table, pulled out a folder worn but intact. Financial records, house deed statements Harold used to print every January. She opened the manila folder and flipped through. Her breath caught. She stopped at a copy of the mortgage agreement dated 3 years ago. It looked identical to the new letter, except the signature wasn't Harold's. She blinked, checked again. Similar strokes, yes. But the H curved the wrong way. The loop in the B too tight. She knew her husband's signature like her own name. This isn't his, she said. Tyrone peered over her shoulder. You sure? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He watched her stand, walk slowly to the bookshelf. She reached up behind a row of worn encyclopedias and pulled down a red spiral-bound notebook. My husband wrote in this every morning, like a ritual. She opened it, turned past pages filled with garden schedules, grocery lists, even book quotes. Then she stopped. The date March 8th, 2021. The entry met with that young banker again. Name's Dylan something. Slick hair, expensive shoes. Keeps asking about refinancing. Told him no. Again. Says I'm missing out. I told him peace is worth more than interest. Celeste sat down slowly, flipped to another page. March 15th, 2021. He came back. Didn't like me asking questions. Had papers. Told me to just sign and trust the process. I refused. He looked disappointed or angry. Hard to tell when someone smiles like that. A beat passed, then another. The room felt smaller, like the house itself was holding its breath again. Tyrone picked up one of the stamped letters, checked the fine print, There it was. Authorized Agent Dylan H. Wilkes. I know that name, he said. He's in the papers. Some hotshot loan officer turned real estate revitalizer. Thinks poor neighborhoods are blank slates. Celeste looked up. Then he picked the wrong widow. It began with a logo, a small gold emblem stamped on the bottom corner of the legal letterhead, 3 stylized rooftops forming a crown. Tyrone noticed it while scanning the last of the forged documents on Celeste's dining table. He enlarged it, ran it through an image search program, and leaned back as the results appeared. Marion Heights Property Trust, he said aloud. Front for something bigger. Celeste looked up from her seat, a pen frozen above her notebook. How much bigger? He clicked again. Owned by a holding company. That company's owned by another. And so on. He turned the screen so she could see a web of shell corporations all looping back to one name. Knox Urban Futures, LLC. Celeste whispered it. Gerald Knox. She remembered the name. Too well. A few years ago, he'd come into the East Grove Library with a blazer too sharp and a smile too wide. Said he wanted to support community knowledge. Donated a modest grant. Asked to see the library's neighborhood census data for research. Took photos with the staff. Left behind a plaque that read, Partner in Literacy. Celeste had kept it in the janitor's closet. Now she knew why. Knox wasn't restoring the community. He was harvesting it, gutting it, parcel by parcel, home by home, all under the banner of revitalization. Tyrone pulled up Knox's LinkedIn. His photo showed a man in his early 30s, white-tan suit wineglass in hand, standing in front of a high-rise skyline. The tagline read, Making cities future ready, one lot at a time. Celeste's jaw clenched. Future ready for whom? Tyrone grunted. Not people like us. Celeste stood and paced the room. This isn't just about my house. This is about all of West Grove. And suddenly it was more than personal. It was systemic. It was a machine dressed in paperwork, stealing without ever breaking a window. Tyrone opened his laptop again. I can dig deeper, he said. Celeste raised an eyebrow. You a hacker now? He gave her a sheepish grin. Let's say I had extracurriculars back in the day. For the next 2 hours, the kitchen transformed into a war room. The old floral tablecloth was buried under spreadsheets, maps, printed screenshots. Tyrone's fingers moved fast, navigating databases not meant for public access. Celeste moved slower, more methodical cross-checking addresses, flagging names she knew from church, the market, the bus stop. Names like Ethel Darby, Mrs. Liu, James and Margaret Ford. All of them elderly, all of them recently relocated under voluntary sell-back agreements. But the signatures on the paperwork, familiar patterns, familiar forgeries. Tyrone found a file labeled Project Renewal, Phase 2, inside a list of properties scheduled for acquisition. Most marked cleared. Some marked in dispute. Celeste's house was on that list. Beside it, a red tag that said, Watch for media attention. Subject Brooks C. The pen in her hand dropped to the table. They knew, she whispered. They planned to make an example of me. The house suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like it too was being watched. Miss Brooks, Tyrone said carefully. We don't have to just survive this. She looked at him. We can expose it. She nodded, eyes sharp now. We will. She retrieved a worn manila folder from a drawer under the sink. Inside, Harold's handwritten ledgers, receipts, notarized copies, even a taped voicemail from the last banker they ever trusted. And in the center, a photo. Gerald Knox, younger, no blazer, standing next to Harold at a community outreach brunch, holding champagne. Harold wasn't smiling. Celeste traced the edge of the image. He never liked him. Said Knox smiled like a man who was already counting what didn't belong to him. Tyrone scanned the photo, uploaded it. Let's see how deep this goes. Hours passed. Outside, the street grew darker. Inside, the lamp over the table cast sharp light over a growing mountain of evidence. The house no longer felt quiet. It felt awake. At 1:27 a.m., Tyrone pushed his chair back. "I found the transfer logs," he said. Celeste, half asleep with her cheek on a ledger, sat up. "These are not legal. They're routed through a back channel. False names, false dates, but real titles." He turned the laptop. The screen showed dozens of homes, dozens of names. Most belonged to the elderly. Most had died. Some, like Celeste, were still standing, still fighting. Celeste leaned back, eyes shining, not with fear but fury. "We take this to the city," she said. "To the press, to anyone who will listen." Tyrone nodded. "And if no one listens?" She folded her arms. "Then we make them here." There were no spotlights, no podiums, no lawyers in suits or reporters with boom mics. Just folding chairs, a leaky ceiling, and the faint scent of mildew from the carpet beneath their feet. The community center on Maple Street had once been a post office, then a daycare, then nothing. But today, it was the stage for a reckoning. Celeste stood at the front of the room, not behind a podium, just a worn wooden table. Beside her, Tyrone's silent, tall arms, folded like a sentry. In front of her neighbors, elders, shopkeepers, nurses, janitors, retired bus drivers, all from West Grove. Some knew her as Miss Brooks from the library. Others hadn't seen her in years. But they came. The table in front of her was covered in manila folders, marked envelopes, and a spiral-bound notebook with frayed corners. One of Harold's old pens sat beside it, uncapped like he might return to finish a thought. Celeste looked out over the crowd. She did not speak loudly. She didn't have to. "When my husband Harold died," she began, "he left me this house, this neighborhood, and a promise that we were safe." She paused, let the room settle. "But last month I was locked out of my own door." There were murmurs. A few heads shook, and I thought it was a mistake. One of those bureaucratic mix-ups. But it wasn't. She held up a letter. "This was sent to my husband, by a law firm he never hired, on behalf of a trust he never knew." She gestured to Tyrone, who clicked his laptop and turned the screen to face the room. A slideshow began. Names, addresses, fake signatures, dozens of them, overlaid on a map of West Grove like a slow-burning infection creeping across the grid. "You know these names," she said. "They're your neighbors, your mothers, your aunts, your Sunday school teachers." She picked up a photo. "This is Mrs. Liu. Her house was voluntarily relinquished. Except she doesn't remember signing anything, because she didn't." Gasps. A few nodded. Mrs. Liu sat in the second row, holding her cane tight. "This," Celeste said, lifting another sheet, "is the name behind it all. Gerald Knox." A hush fell. People remembered the man. The fancy suits. The way he'd walked through their streets with photographers in tow, pointing at things that didn't need fixing, talking about urban renewal. He smiled for the cameras, Celeste said. But he was already drawing lines through our homes. A hand raised. "What can we do?" Celeste met their eyes. "We speak. We share. We file. We fight." Tyrone leaned forward. "We've uploaded everything. The documents, the forgeries, the paper trails. They're online now. If you want to see them, they're there. If reporters want them, they'll find them." By the end of the hour, the room buzzed with a strange electricity, the kind born when silence realizes it's done playing dead. That night, the story broke. Small at first, a blog post from a local watchdog page. Then a tweet. Then a reshared post from someone in city planning. Then WGR News called. Then Channel 5. By morning, they were asking for interviews. Celeste declined. She said everything she needed to in that room. But Gerald Knox did not stay quiet. By Monday, he was at Town Hall. Clean-shaven, tailored in slate gray and flanked by 2 lawyers. He held a press conference near the steps, spoke of misunderstandings, automation errors, and complex property portfolios. When asked about Celeste Brooks, He offered a tight smile. She's grieving, understandably distraught. These things happen when elderly individuals face change. The next day, Celeste arrived at the same hall. Not to give a press conference, but to deliver a file. Inside notarized statements, Harold's notebook, and at the top, a copy of a contract with Gerald Knox's signature. Real, blue ink, not a scan. It was from a brunch 2 years ago. Harold had written beside it in the notebook, "Slick boy tried to rush me." Signed nothing. Took his paper with him. Left angry. But the copy Celeste held now, it had Harold's name. Faked. Signed while Harold was in hospice. Signed by someone else. And beneath it Knox's signature. Real. Celeste stepped into the hall, turned the notebook to the page, and showed the counsel. "I didn't come for a fight," she said, her voice even. "I came to return what was stolen." No one clapped. But one by one the room stood. The story spread. Not because of the scandal, but because of the silence that broke. In the days following the hearing, the city launched an official inquiry. A task force was formed. Local papers ran front-page exposés with headlines like "The Widow Who Unlocked West Grove" and "Fake Signatures, Real Evictions." Gerald Knox was subpoenaed. 2 executives resigned. And overnight, West Grove was no longer a footnote. It was a battleground. And at the center stood a retired librarian with gray curls and a notebook that held the truth. Celeste didn't celebrate. She returned to her house quietly, as always, watered her late husband's cherry tree, refilled the bird feeder, swept the porch. But now neighbors passed by and nodded. Some stopped to thank her. One boy on a bike called out, "Miss Brooks, you're on TV." She only smiled. Inside, the house had changed. Not in paint or furniture, but in presence. There was no longer a fear of losing it. Now it stood because she did. That evening, Tyrone came by. He wasn't in his usual hoodie and jeans. He wore a clean-collared shirt, held a paper bag of groceries. "I figured we could cook," he said, stepping into the kitchen. Celeste raised an eyebrow. "You cook now. Let's call it survival." They boiled rice, stirred lentils, sliced tomatoes. The kitchen smelled like something new, a recipe unmeasured but familiar. As they ate by the window, rain began to patter on the sill. Tyrone looked out. "You think they'll try again?" Celeste sipped her tea. "Maybe. Systems don't die easy. But now the light's on. They'll have to steal in daylight." He nodded. She reached under the table, pulled out a small tin box, and placed it between them. Inside 2 old keys. One tarnished, one still bright. "This was the key Harold made for the front door," she said. "And this one." She paused, picking up the newer one. "This is the one I never gave away." Tyrone looked at her. "Why not?" "Because there's a difference between opening a door and owning what's behind it." She handed him the brighter key. Not as a gift, but as trust. "I don't need you to protect this place," she said softly. "I just need you to remind me it's worth protecting." He took it without a word. Later that night, she lit a candle in the window. Not for show, but for memory. The cherry tree swayed gently in the wind petals, falling like soft reminders of everything she'd stood through. And in the silence that followed, with no cameras, no councilmen, no signatures, Celeste Brooks sat in her house, holding the only key that ever truly mattered, the one she never gave away.